On the night of the 19th November, 1941, the HMAS Sydney was lost with all hands. It had been engaged and sunk by the German auxiliary cruiser Corman off the coast of Western Australia. It was the greatest naval tragedy in Australia's history. The most intriguing parts of this tragedy were the fact that the Sydney was sunk by an inferior German raider and that it had been lost with all hands. The only accounts came from the Germans as there were no Australian survivors. Questions abounded from the public. How had the German raider managed to sink the Sydney? What had happened? Who was to blame? These questions would continue for another 70 years until the wrecks of the Sydney and the Corman were found and the stories of the German crew validated. This video seeks to answer those questions. You can cut that if you want. Captain Theodor Detmers was the commanding officer of the German auxiliary cruiser Corman. He had been to Australia before during peacetime and had died on one of the RAN's own ships. He knew the strength of his enemy. His mission was to hunt down Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean. His ship, the Corman, was a repurposed merchant vessel that had been converted into a raider. It was currently disguised as the Dutch merchant ship, the Straat Malacca. It had hidden weaponry that could be mechanically brought out when it was to engage another ship. It was armed with 6 15cm guns, 2 3.7cm pack anti-tank guns, 5 2cm AA guns, and 6 torpedo tubes. It also carried a number of mines. The Corman had almost no armour to speak of. Its top speed was 18 knots. Its guns had a maximum range of 10 kilometres. Captain Joseph Burnett was the captain of the HMAS Sydney. He had only been in the position for 6 months before the sinking of the Sydney and his subsequent demise. He had participated in World War I but had seen minimal action. The Sydney was returning to Melbourne after escorting a troop ship when it caught sight of the Corman, then an unknown ship, to it and followed. The HMAS Sydney was a light cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy. Its crew had seen action in the Mediterranean and had distinguished themselves in battle against Italian ships. It was armed with 8 15cm guns, 4 10cm anti-aircraft guns, 12 1.3cm Vickers machine guns, 9 7.7mm Lewis guns, and 8 torpedo tubes. It had 2.5cm hull plating, 7.5cm machinery armour, and 5cm armour around the magazines. It had a top speed of 32 knots. Its main guns could fire up to 20 kilometres away. At 15:55 hours, the Corman sighted the Sydney. Although unsure of what they had sighted, they were reasonably sure it was a military ship and immediately turned away into the sun at full speed to flee. The Sydney began to chase down the Corman, and due to its superior speed, managed to catch up with it. It began to signal the Corman with signal lamps, asking what ship and what goods were they carrying. The Corman responded using slow signal flags, which were typical of merchants. At 17:15 hours, the Sydney was close to parallel to the Corman, and was estimated to be 900 metres away by Detmers. This was close to point-blank range, and had completely invalidated the Sydney's 10-kilometre range advantage over the Corman. The German officers noted that the crew of the Sydney were walking very slowly, and a lot of officers on the bridge looking very easygoing. They also noted that the Sydney was putting back in its recon plane, which if launched would have revealed the Corman's concealed guns. Eventually, the Sydney messaged to the Corman, "Show your secret signal." After a quick confirmation that they did not know it, Detmers gave the order to raise the German war flag, fire. It was 17:30 hours, and the engagement with the Sydney had begun. Cormoran's first salvo from its 15cm guns were misses, but its pack anti-tank guns immediately hit the bridge of the Sydney, along with its 2cm anti-aircraft guns. Soon after, its 15cm guns found their range and started hitting the bridge as well. It was only 20 seconds after the beginning of the battle, but by this stage the entire bridge crew of the Sydney would be dead. Detmers' crew had been well trained. During this, the Sydney had managed to fire off one salvo which had missed. Sydney's A and B turrets were knocked out by the highly accurate fire from the Corman. The Sydney's aircraft was also hit by fire from the Corman, and exploded, throwing shrapnel and flaming fuel all over the Sydney. Soon, the Sydney's X and Y turrets managed to start opening fire on the Cormorant, with X turrets scoring immediate hits. A shell went through the Cormorant's funnel, setting fire to oil that was being pumped through there, and setting the engine room alight. More shells shot through the engine room, making gas leak and putting its firefighting system out of action. A torpedo suddenly blew up underneath the Sydney's bow, reaching its hull and weakening the structure. This is what later sunk the Sydney when the bow catastrophically fell off while the Sydney was fleeing the battle. Now the Sydney fell silent and sailed away while being pounded by the Cormorant's guns. The Cormorant itself was stationary due to its engine problems. Soon thereafter, the two ships drifted out of range, and the Sydney was never seen again by living eyes. 55 minutes after its start, the battle was over. The Cormorant had suffered badly during the battle, and detonators gave the order to abandon ship when it became clear that the engine fire was uncontrollable and would soon engulf the ship and spread to the mines, setting them off. A while after abandoning ship, the mines blew up with a shockwave that was felt from Geraldton. This is what happened on the night of November 19th November 1941. Captain Detmers and 318 of his 399 crew were later rescued. None of the Australian crew survived. Of course, this presents many problems for historians, who only have access to one side of the battle. Can Captain Detmers and his crew be trusted? Recent examination has decided that they can. Captain Detmers never changed his story, and the reports that he managed to smuggle back to Germany are the same as what he told the Australian officials. His diary and 3 other accounts written by him all say the same things as each other with minor differences. The wrecks of both ships corroborate both him and his officer's testimony. It can be reasonably assumed that the German account is true. Now to the crux of the matter. How did the HMAS Sydney get beaten and sunk by the Cormorant? The main reason for this is the fact that the Sydney came so close to the Cormorant. The two ships came within such a distance that whichever ship fired first would inflict grievous damage upon the other and cripple it. In naval terms, 900 meters is point-blank range. Usual engagements are over multiple kilometers of sea, but this particular engagement was within 1 kilometer. Even though the Cormorant had inferior weaponry, it had a ready and experienced crew that was expecting action. They managed to surprise their enemy and cripple them in the opening stages of the battle. Despite the accurate shots fired by the German crew, however, the Sydney did not sink at first. A lucky torpedo shot hit the Sydney's bow, piercing the armor and letting the water flood in. While the Sydney was fleeing the battle and presumably its crew was trying to keep it afloat, the bow catastrophically fell off, making water immediately rush into the ship and sinking the Sydney within a few minutes. Most historians agree that another reason behind the destruction of the Sydney was the carelessness of Captain Burnett. He had let the Sydney get within 900 meters of an unknown ship that turned out to be a prepared enemy raider. Burnett also failed to deploy the reconnaissance plane, which would have spotted the Cormorant's hidden guns and alerted him to the Cormorant's fate. Disguise. Sadly, we shall never know the reasoning behind his actions. It may have been that Captain Detmer's bluff worked and that Captain Burnett fell for it, thinking that the Cormorant was nothing more than a merchant raider. But it was the assumption that the Cormorant was nothing more than a merchant ship that ultimately cost Australia the Sydney.